Hi dear children, today in this class, let's learn about the poetic devices used in the poem Mending Wall written by Robert Frost. What is a poetic device? A poetic device is a technique or a tool that is used to make a poem more beautiful. There are mainly three purposes for using poetic devices. The first one is to create a rhythm in a poem. The second purpose of poetic devices is to intensify the mood of the poem. There is one more purpose of using poetic devices in poems, that is to emphasize or to enhance the meaning of the poem. So these are the major purposes of poetic devices. Now let's have a look at the poetic devices used in this particular poem, Mending Wall. A major device used by Robert Frost is imagery in the poem Mending Wall. Imagery is used to make the readers perceive things with their five senses. Frost uses visual imagery for a better understanding of the story. For example, the line, "And some are loaves and some are nearly balls." Here he gives the word picture of the stones to get a clear idea of the shape of the stone. So a visual imagery helps the readers to get a word picture. So there the poet gives the minute details of the picture. Then only the reader can picturize that in their minds. Another example for a visual imagery in the poem is, "I see him there bringing a stone grasped firmly by top in each hand like an old stone savage armed." So the reader can imagine the second neighbor who looks like a Stone Age man, a savage, taking stones in his hands. The poet gives a pen picture or a word picture through the lines. That is also an example for visual imagery. The poet uses kinesthetic imagery while he describes the neighbors mending the wall. In kinesthetic imagery, one gives a picture of a movement. For example, in the lines, "We keep the wall between us as we go to each the boulders that have fallen to each." There the readers get the picture of the neighbors' movement, how they walk, placing the boulders on the wall. That movement we get in our minds. So there lies kinesthetic imagery. The second poetic device used in the poem is symbolism. It's a major poetic device in the poem Mending Wall because here Robert Frost uses a lot of symbols. For example, the wall in the poem is the most important symbol. The wall symbolizes discrimination among people. It shows various barriers like class, caste, creed, color, gender, region, and language. In the poem, the wall is not just a line between two neighbors' fields. It is a wall between the attitudes of two neighbors. It divides minds. It is also a barrier to communication too. Another important symbol in the poem is fence. Fence symbolizes gap or distance between people. Again, the word darkness is symbolic. It symbolizes ignorance. Darkness is a symbol to denote ignorance. When the poet says his neighbor moves in darkness, he conveys the neighbor's attitude. The neighbor is ignorant and narrow-minded, the view of the poet. Again, the poet uses another symbol, spring. Spring symbolizes happiness and enthusiasm. Again, the word mischief is also can be considered as a symbol. Here, mischief represents innocent children. The next important poetic device is irony. Irony is a paradoxical sentence or situation. A situation becomes ironic if what happens is the exact opposite of what was expected. For example, "But they would have the rabbit out of hiding to please the yelping dogs." We expect the dog helps man in hunting, but here the hunter catches the rabbit to please his dog. So the situation is ironic. Another example of irony in the poem we find is good fences make good neighbor. Usually we use a fence to separate things, but here the speaker says it makes good neighbors. That is, it unites two neighbors. Here also we see a contradictory situation. What he says is just the opposite of what we expect. Robert Frost uses the poetic device refrain in his poem Mending Wall. Refrain is the repetition of lines to emphasize the idea. In the poem, we see two examples of refrain. First one, something there is that doesn't love a wall. And the second refrain we find in the poem is another line, good fences make good neighbors. The two lines emphasize the attitudes of two neighbors. The first line, something there is that doesn't love a wall, shows the first neighbor's view. The line, good fences make good neighbors, shows the second neighbor's attitude. These lines are repeated to stress on the difference in the attitudes of two neighbors. Robert Frost uses enjambment, another poetic device, abundantly in Mending Wall. Enjambment is the continuation of a sentence without a pause beyond the end of a line, couplet or stanza. That means the idea of one line continues in the next line too, and there is no pause in between these two lines. That means there is no punctuations like a full stop or comma between these two lines. For example, in Mending Wall we see the line, why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But there are no cows. So in the first line ends with the phrase, isn't it? But we know that it is not complete with that phrase. In the second line, it continues with the sentence, isn't it where there are cows? So here we see the example for enjambment. The idea of the first line is continuing in the second line and there is no comma or full stop in between these two lines. Another example we find in Mending Wall is, before I built a wall, I would ask to know what I was walling in or walling out. Again, the idea is complete after the second line and there is no pause after the first line. We can see more examples in the poem like, but it's not else exactly and I would rather he said it for himself. And a third example, spring is the mischief in me and I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. Again, bringing a stone grasp firmly by the top in each hand. In all these lines, the idea is not complete with the first line and without any pause, the sentence or the idea goes on in the second line. We can see more examples for enjambment in the same poem. Another poetic device used in the poem is Anaphora. Anaphora is the repetition of the first word or words of a line in consecutive lines. You can see two examples for Anaphora in the poem. First one, and spills the upper boulders in the sun and makes gaps even two can pass abreast. The word and, that is the first word of the first line, that is repeated in the second line too. Again another example with the same word and. And on a day we meet to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. So these two are examples of Anaphora in Mending Wall. A major poetic device, parallelism, is also used in this poem. Parallelism is a literary technique in which two or more phrases repeat the same grammatical structure. Usually, one or more words changed in the repetition. I'll give you some examples from the text. First one is, good fences make good neighbors. Here the phrase good fences is almost repeated in good neighbors, but one word is changed. Another example, no one has seen the maid or heard the maid. Again the structural pattern, seen the maid, heard the maid. It's almost similar. That means it's a kind of repetition, but some words in the phrase have changed. In the first one it is seen, The second one, it is heard. The word seen is replaced by the word heard. Another example, to each the boulders that have fallen to each. To each is repeated at the end of the line too. Again, some more examples I'll give you. And some are loaves and some so nearly balls. Where there are cows, but here there are no cows. Did you notice the parallelism? Some are loaves, some so nearly balls. Almost similar in structure, but some words are changed. Again, where there are cows, here there are. Repetition. Again, before I built a wall, I would ask to know what I was walling in or walling out. Walling in, walling out. Again, repetition with the slight changes. Again, we can see parallelism in the physical form in the poem. Here the two neighbors, they are parallel in their attitudes. We meet to walk the line. We keep the wall between us as we go. So there is no structural parallelism, but we know in their meaning that parallel form is present. One on a side. So here the mental and physical wall. That makes two men or two minds remain parallel. We can see parallelism in the language as well as the image of the two men. Pun, another poetic device, is a play on words. Sometimes a word is used with different meanings. Usually pun is used as humorous, but in Mending Wall, pun is used to get a serious tone to the poem, or it increases the serious mood of the poem. For example, there is a pun in the word offense in the line, and to whom I was like to give offense. The word offense includes another word offense in it. It suggests he is offending by making a fence. That means, using a single word, the poet conveyed two ideas. In the word offense, he hides another word fence, or he hides two words offense and fence. And there we can see a pun. Assonance and consonance are the common poetic devices poets use to enhance the rhythm of the poem. And here in Mending Wall also, Robert Frost uses these two poetic devices abundantly. We can see a lot of examples for assonance and consonance in the poem Mending Wall. Assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds in a line or adjacent lines. As I already said, there are many examples we can find in the poem Mending Wall, and I give you some of them here. In the 7th line, can read, where they would have left not one stone on a stone. Here, O sound is repeated. Not one stone on a stone. On, 3 times. We hear the O sound. Again, another example in the 9th line. To please the yelping dogs, the gaps I mean. Please, mean. E sound is repeated. Again, it's a vowel sound, so assonance is there. Then in 29th line, if I could put a notion in his head, could put. O sound is repeated. Again in 38th line, he said it for himself. I see him there. He, see. E sound is repeated. Again, example for assonance. You can find out some more examples in the poem. Next one is consonance. Consonance is the repetition of consonant sounds in the middle or end of the words. Usually these words are close to one another. And I'll give you some examples from the text. And makes gaps even two can pass abreast. Makes gaps. So sound is repeated. Again another line. I have come after them and made repair. Here come them. Sound is repeated. And so again consonants. Next example is where they would have left not one stone on a stone. One stone on a stone. and sound is repeated there. Again, consonants. To please the yelping dogs, the gaps I mean. Here also we can see the repetition of s sound, dogs and gaps. Again in the second stanza we see another example for consonants, that is, if I could put a notion in his head. Could, head. D sound is repeated there too. These are the major examples we find out in the text, and if you go through the lines you can see some more examples for consonants in the poem Mending Wall. Find it out. The next one is alliteration. Alliteration is repetition of the initial consonant sounds in a line or adjacent lines. We saw the repetition of consonant sounds in the middle or end of the words in consonants. Alliteration, again it is the repetition of consonant sounds, but this repetition comes in the beginning of the word. I give you some examples from the poem Mending Wall. And spills the upper boulders in the sun. Spills. S sound is the beginning sound of the word spills, and again in sun, S sound is the beginning sound, and so the beginning sound S is repeated here. The poetic device is alliteration. And some are loaves and some so nearly balls, but some so. S sound is repeated, and so alliteration. Again another example is, in each hand like an old stone savage armed. Stone savage, S sound is repeated. Again example for alliteration. Poetic devices, assonance, consonance, alliteration, mainly used to give a rhythm to the line by repeating the same sound. In an assonance, vowel sound is repeated, while in consonants and alliteration, the consonant sounds are repeated. Now let's discuss some very familiar figures of speech. They are also poetic devices. Let's look at personification first. It is giving human attributes to an inanimate object, you know. So there are three examples we can see in the text for personification. The first one is, something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends a frozen groundswell under it, and spills the upper boulders in the sun, and makes gaps even two can pass abreast. Here, something is considered as a person that doesn't love a wall and that sends, spills and makes gaps. So here the word something is personified, and so personification is the figure of speech in that line. Another example is, my apple trees will never get across and eat the corns under his spines. Here apple tree is given a human attribute. Stay where you are until our backs are turned. Here boulders are asked to stay at their position. The poet considers boulders as people who obey his command. Here also this non-living object, rock piece, boulder, is getting a human quality. The next figure of speech is simile. Simile, as we all know, comparing one to another one. Usually we use the expressions like or as to compare two things. And it is easy to find out where the simile is used. The poet says, I see him there, bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top in each hand, like an old stone savage armed. So here, neighbor is like an old stone savage armed. Neighbor is compared to an old stone savage armed. So the comparison is very clear. So simile is the figure of speech. The next figure of speech is metaphor. We have seen a lot of metaphors in the poem Any Woman. Here we can see one or two examples for metaphor in this poem too. Some are loaves and some so nearly balls. The poet says some rocks are loaves and some rocks are balls. Actually, rock is an entirely different object from both a loaf and a ball. But in this particular context, the poet feels that they are same. So the figure of speech is metaphor. Another example is, he is on pine and I am apple orchard. We know that his neighbor, poet's neighbor is not pine, but he has a pine field. And the poet says he is apple orchard. We know that the poet is not apple orchard, but he has apple orchard. Again, we can see the central metaphor in the poem, a wall. Actually, wall is, or it represents, divisions or separations among people. Another poetic device used in the poem is epigram. Epigram is a rhetorical device. It is used to make a brief, interesting, memorable, and sometimes satirical statement. Here in the poem, good fences make good neighbors. It is repeated again in the last line. This sentence or this line can be considered as an example for epigram. It's a brief and interesting saying, and it's easy to memorize, and it contains a witty meaning. Another poetic device we find in the poem is apostrophe. Apostrophe is a device in which we see somebody is speaking to an imaginary person. In the line, stay where you are until our backs are turned, this poetic device is used, apostrophe. Here, the speaker is speaking to an imaginary person. There is no person at all. Now let's check the rhyme scheme of the poem. We cannot see any rhymed lines in this poem, and so we call the rhyme scheme as blank verse. Blank verse is written with regular metrical but unrhymed lines. Dear children, I hope I have touched all the poetic devices used in the poem Mending Wall. Now it's your duty to learn all these poetic devices. Let me wind up today's session. Thank you.